The first person to hear the helicopter was not the trauma team. It was the new nurse in the service corridor, one hand resting on a metal laundry cart, the other steadying a stack of warm blankets she had just pulled from the dryer. Myra Bennett paused before the swinging double doors and listened. Above the hum of the hospital vents and the clatter of carts rolling over tile, there it was again, that low, hard, chopping thunder that made everyone inside a coastal medical center look up at the same time. A helicopter. Not the sightseeing kind. Not the news kind. The kind that made men in uniforms stop joking and nurses stop walking. Mara lifted her eyes toward the ceiling without moving anything else on her face. She had learned a long time ago that panic spread faster than blood, and stillness could save more lives than shouting ever did. The overhead speakers crackled. Helipad arrival in 4 minutes. Emergency transfer inbound. Trauma Team B to receiving. Then, after a beat, a second voice came sharper, more urgent. Repeat, helipad arrival in 4 minutes. Possible military transfer. Around her, the service corridor erupted. A transport aide nearly dropped a crate of linens. 2 orderlies rushed past her toward the elevator. Somebody upstairs shouted for trauma kits. Somewhere down the hall, a woman swore under her breath. Myra looked at the blankets on her cart, adjusted one corner so it would not drag, and continued walking. That was the thing about St. Gabriel Regional. People only noticed a quiet person when they wanted something carried, cleaned, or blamed. And for the past 3 weeks, the new nurse had been useful for all 3. If you have ever seen somebody dismissed before anyone bothered to learn their name, stay with this story. Because what happened that afternoon inside St. Gabriel started with a laundry cart and ended with a hospital full of people realizing they had been walking past the wrong woman all along. Mara Bennett was 47 years old, broad-shouldered without being heavy, composed without being cold, and disciplined in a way that made younger staff assume she was stiff. She wore navy scrubs under a pale gray clinical jacket with her badge clipped neatly at the collar. Her hair was pinned back. Her shoes were spotless. Her charting was clean. Her voice, when she used it, never rose above the level of the room. That last part confused people. At St. Gabriel, the people who wanted authority usually announced it every 10 minutes. Mara never did. She had come to the hospital with a short resume and a long silence. Critical care, emergency stabilization, surgical recovery, travel assignments. No bragging, no references from television-famous surgeons, no dramatic stories at orientation. She had signed the hearing paperwork, sat through compliance training, and accepted a temporary float position without a single complaint. That had been enough for the charge nurse, Kelsey Trent, to make up the rest. Kelsey was 31, fast, sharp, and permanently annoyed by anybody she could not place immediately in the hospital pecking order. She liked loud confidence, expensive coffee, and younger nurses who reacted to her approval like sunlight. Mara gave her none of that. She was older than Kelsey, calmer than Kelsey, and apparently unimpressed by the little performances Kelsey did at the nurses' station whenever a physician walked by. So Kelsey had made a decision early. The new nurse was not one of the real trauma people. At first it came out in small ways. Mara would be scheduled for triage support and then reassigned to discharge paperwork. She would volunteer to help in the ER and be sent instead to restock supply closets. She would arrive 10 minutes early for handoff and find that the interesting cases had already been split between the real team. By the second week, the jokes had started. Ask float nurse. Maybe the new lady wants to fold sheets. She looks like she ironed her scrubs. Once, one of the younger nurses had laughed and asked Mara whether she had spent her last contract in some nice little clinic where nothing serious ever happened. Mara had simply looked at the medication tray in front of her and replied, no. That had irritated them more than a speech would have. Because people who belittle others are usually hopping for a reaction. Anger gives them a fight, tears give them power, silence gives them a mirror. And most people hate mirrors. Still, not everyone at St. Gabriel treated her like background furniture. Lee Morneau, a first-year nurse barely out of residency, noticed things. She noticed that Mara could glance at a monitor from 20 feet away and tell when a patient was drifting before the machine alarmed. She noticed that veterans spoke to her differently, as if something in the woman's posture made them feel safe without knowing why. She noticed that Mara always checked airway equipment herself, never because she was anxious, but because she had the habits of someone who had learned the cost of trusting a room too quickly. Most of all, Lee noticed that the quiet new nurse never wasted movement. Everything she did had a purpose, even folding sheets. Especially folding sheets. The morning the helicopter came in had already gone badly. A linen delivery had been delayed. A post-op patient had coded at dawn. One of the residents had written the wrong pain order on the wrong chart. The emergency department was packed, and Kelsey was in the kind of mood that made everybody else start speaking more softly. At 11:30, Mara was in Trauma 3 helping an older man named Mr. Havorson breathe through a panic episode after imaging. He was a retired machinist with a chest scar and shaking hands, and every time he looked at the bright lights above him, his pulse climbed another 10 beats. Mara didn't bombard him with instructions. She lowered the rail, adjusted the blanket, and said, "Look at me, not the ceiling. In through your nose. Good. Again." He obeyed. Within a minute, the numbers on the monitor were settling. Within 2 minutes, he was calm enough to answer questions again. Dr. Rowan entered just as Mara was listening to the man's lungs. He was the senior attending for the afternoon shift, a competent physician who had mastered the hospital art of appearing decisive even when he was uncertain. He looked from the monitor to the patient to Mara's hands and said, "What happened?" "Nothing dangerous," Mara said. "Panic loop after transport. He's stabilizing." Dr. Rowan checked the chart, then looked up. "You got him down fast." Mr. Havorson managed a strained smile. "She talks like somebody who knows what she's doing." Before Mara could reply, Kelsey appeared in the doorway. "There you are," she snapped. "Why are you in Trauma 3? We need those warm blankets restocked downstairs, and Central Linen still hasn't sent enough. Transport is backed up, and we're out in Service B." Mara straightened. Mr. Havorson was in distress. "And now he is." Kelsey forced a bright smile at Dr. Rowan. "I've got it from here. Mara, go handle the laundry shortage." Lee, standing near the computer station, glanced up sharply. Even she could hear the edge in it. Mara removed her gloves, disposed of them, and said, "Understood." Mr. Havorson frowned. "The laundry." Kelsey answered for her. "All hands where they're needed." It was a clever line. Clean, professional, hard to challenge out loud. But everyone in the room knew what had just happened. A nurse had calmed a patient in a trauma bay, and the response had been to send her downstairs with linens. Lee waited until Kelsey walked off, then stepped closer. "I can do Service B." Mara shook her head once. "You're needed up here." "That's not the point." "I know." Mara gave her the faintest hint of a smile. "Still go." So Lee stayed. And Mara took the elevator down. The service level of St. Gabriel smelled faintly of detergent, hot cotton, and industrial bleach. It was a basement nobody bragged about, but everybody depended on: rows of shelves, supply cages, rolling bins, warming cabinets, and stacks of folded blankets that meant the difference between comfort and chaos during an intake rush. Mara worked there with the same care she used everywhere else. She checked counts, reorganized the warming unit, separated clean from compromised stock, found 3 mislabeled transport packs, and corrected them. Discovered that half the problem wasn't the delivery delay at all. Someone upstairs had been overpulling supplies without logging them. She was loading a cart with warmed blankets, saline packs, and fresh gowns when the first helicopter tremor ran through the building. Then came the announcement. Then the second announcement. Then the rush. 2 minutes later, the service corridor door slammed open, and a respiratory therapist ran through without seeing her. "Military inbound," he shouted to someone behind him. Helipad said there are armed escorts. Armed escorts. That got people moving faster than any normal transfer would. Mara finished securing the top blanket and started toward the elevator. By the time the doors opened on the receiving floor, the corridor had transformed. Security was posted near the helipad access doors. Dr. Rowan was in a lead apron half-buttoned over his scrubs, speaking quickly with an ER resident. Lee was carrying intubation, supplies toward Trauma One. Kelsey was standing at the nurse's station, issuing assignments like a woman conducting an orchestra she wanted credit for. When she saw Mara emerge with the cart, her mouth tightened. "Leave the linens and clear the hallway," she said. "We don't need extra bodies clogging receiving." Mara parked the cart against the wall. Then the helipad doors burst open. Cold air hit first. Then noise. Then motion. 2 Navy corpsmen pushed through with a gurney at a near run, followed by a hard-faced senior officer in dress-trimmed operational uniform and 3 men in tactical outerwear carrying equipment cases. The patient on the gurney was unconscious, broad-chested, intubated, and gray under the oxygen mask. Blood had soaked through the dressings at his side and thigh. The portable monitor screamed with a rhythm too fast and too unstable for comfort. 46-year-old male, one corpsman barked. Blast injury during training transfer, unstable pressure, repeated desat, possible occult bleed, old thoracic repair deteriorating on transport. "We need Trauma One now," Dr. Rowan interrupted. The senior officer did not stop moving. "We need your trauma bay," he said, "and we need Triage One." Everything around him seemed to pause. Kelsey blinked. "I'm sorry, who?" "Triage One." His eyes swept the room. "Mara Bennett." This time, the pause felt different. Longer. As if the hospital itself needed a second to understand what had just been said. Kelsey let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Mara, the float nurse." The officer's gaze shifted to her, flat and unamused. "Lieutenant Commander Mara Bennett," he said. "Retired, where is she?" Lee turned before anyone else did. Mara was standing beside the linen cart, one hand still on the handle, face unreadable. The officer saw her and stopped dead. For one brief second, his controlled expression cracked, not with confusion, but recognition so immediate it looked like relief. He crossed the corridor in 3 strides. "Triage One," he said quietly, staring at her. "I hope to God they'd put the right Bennett on the roster." Mara looked at the patient on the gurney, then back at the officer. "Who is it?" "Chief Ryan Mercer." Something shifted in her eyes then. Not panic, not surprise, something older, heavier. A sealed door opening 1 inch. "How long since the blast?" 43 minutes. "What fluids?" 2 units whole blood, 1 plasma, pressure unstable, left chest decompressed in transit. She nodded once, then she looked at Dr. Rowan. "His old thoracic repair matters," she said. "If you push the standard left approach blind, you could tear the graft." Dr. Rowan frowned. "You know his history." "I was there when he got it." The resident stopped moving. Lee's mouth parted. Kelsey stood frozen, still trying to recover the part of the conversation where the quiet nurse from laundry had apparently become the person the Navy had demanded by name. Mara stepped away from the cart. Her voice did not rise. But for the first time since she had arrived at St. Gabriel, it carried authority that did not ask permission from the room. "Trauma One," she said. "Warm blood now. Thoracic tray opened but hold left entry until ultrasound. Respiratory, I want waveform and repeat breath sounds. Lee, with me. Dr. Rowan, if you're leading, I'll brief while we move." And because competence is one of the few things that can silence ego on contact, they moved. Inside Trauma One, the room tightened around the patient like a fist. Monitors snapped into place. Gloves came on. Scissors cut through fabric. The corpsman transferred Ryan Mercer to the hospital bed, and Mara got her first clear look at him. She had not seen him in 9 years. Back then he had been louder, younger, impossible to intimidate, and too stubborn to stay down after being hit by flying metal on a blackwater extraction platform off a hostile coast. He had called her ma'am exactly once before she told him never to do it again in the middle of a bleed. Now he was pale, scarred, and 1 bad minute from dying on a civilian trauma table. Mara leaned over him, scanned the dressings, the swelling, the monitor, the tube position, the chest rise. "Mercer," she said, though she knew he could not answer, "you pick terrible reunion plans." Commander Elias Shaw, because that was who the officer was, though most of the people in the room did not know it yet, stood at the edge of the bay and gave Dr. Rowan a compressed explanation. Chief Mercer served under a joint maritime rescue task unit. Bennett ran emergency triage for us in-country. If she says the old repair matters, it matters. Dr. Rowan did not waste time defending his pride. "Fine," he said, "talk." So Mara talked. She spoke fast, clear, and without drama. "Old shrapnel injury here," she said, pointing to the left upper thorax. "Emergency graft placed overseas. Scar tissue root is ugly. He also had a pressure collapse the first time because the bleed tracked low before it presented high. Check the abdomen again. Don't trust the obvious wound." The ultrasound tech swept the probe. Dark fluid appeared where it should not have been. The resident inhaled sharply. "There." "Exactly," Mara said. For the next 20 minutes, the room stopped being a hospital hierarchy and became what emergency rooms become when death is close enough to smell. A machine. Mara slipped into it like she had never left. She caught an incorrect instrument request before it reached the tray. Noticed the change in pressure 2 beats before the monitor alarmed. Repositioned a line. Ordered warming before hypothermia could complicate the bleed. When the resident hesitated over a medication dose, she corrected him so gently that only he and Lee seemed to notice. At one point, Kelsey stepped in to ask whether she should move another incoming case to trauma too. Mara did not even turn her head. "Yes," she said, "and pull an extra suction setup. This bay is going long." Kelsey obeyed. She obeyed because there was no room left for anything else. Because every person in that room had already realized the same thing. The woman they had sent to laundry was the calmest one there. Ryan crashed once. Pressure dropped. Saturation dipped. The monitor flattened, just enough to make the entire bay hold 1 breath together. Mara's left hand went to the compressive dressing, while her right pointed to the line that needed flushing. "Not there, here, follow the blood loss, not the noise." Dr. Rowan did. 30 seconds later, they had him back. Not safe. Not stable. But back. And in those 30 seconds, Lee understood why Mara moved the way she did. This was not intelligence from a textbook. This was memory in muscle. This was a person who had done this in rooms with worse lighting, less equipment, and bullets outside the walls. Once Mercer was out of immediate free fall and heading toward OR, the room exhaled for the first time. Dr. Rowan stripped off 1 glove, looked at Mara, and said, "You buried the lead on your resume." Mara gave him a tired glance. "My resume was enough for the job." Before he could answer, Commander Shaw stepped forward. "To be fair, Doctor," he said, "some of the lead was classified when she retired." That got everyone's attention all over again. Kelsey, who had been hovering by the computer as if proximity could somehow repair the last hour, stared openly now. Lee looked between Mara and Shaw like she was assembling an entirely new person out of the scraps she had been allowed to see. Shaw continued, his voice steady. "Lieutenant Commander Mara Bennett served as a trauma and field stabilization officer attached to a joint maritime medical unit supporting special operations extraction teams. Her call sign was Triage One because every time things went bad, she was the one who kept the line between chaos and death from collapsing." Nobody said anything. Even the monitors seemed quieter. Shaw turned toward Mara. "Ryan asked for you before he lost consciousness. He didn't know where we were landing, just kept saying, "Get Triage One if she's there." One of our corpsmen looked at the intake roster when dispatch named the facility and saw your last name. Mara looked at the closed doors to the OR corridor. He remembered. Shaw almost smiled. He remembers every person who carried him out when he should have died. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. Before, it had been confusion. Now it was shame. Because public humiliation is powerful. But public correction is stronger. Donna Hales, the nursing supervisor who usually stayed comfortably above the mess until a mess became politically dangerous, arrived at that exact moment. She took in the Navy presence, the reopened trauma bay, Kelsey's face, Mara's posture, and Dr. Rowan's expression, and immediately understood she had missed something important. "What's happening?" she asked. Dr. Rowan answered before anyone else could. "What's happening?" he said. "Is that your float nurse just saved the only patient in this building who would have died under standard approach. And I'd like to know why someone with her experience was restocking laundry instead of being in receiving." Nobody looked at Donna. They looked at Kelsey. Kelsey swallowed. "We were assigning based on current departmental fit." "No," Lee said quietly. Every head turned toward her. Lee rarely interrupted anyone. But once truth decides to speak, it does not always choose the loudest mouth. "She was assigning based on what she thought of Mara," Lee said, "not what Mara could do." Kelsey's face flushed. "That's not fair." Lee did not back down. "It's exactly fair." Donna's jaw tightened the way administrative jaws do when they realize the real problem is not the crisis, but the witness list. "Mara," she began, shifting toward a conciliatory tone, "if there has been any misunderstanding about role utilization." Mara raised a hand slightly. Not rude. Not emotional. Just enough to stop the sentence. "It can wait," she said. "The patient comes first." That should have embarrassed them more than anger would have. Because even then, with half the floor suddenly aware that she had been badly mishandled, Mara was still protecting the room before herself. While Ryan Mercer was in surgery, the Navy team remained near the OR hall. The hospital buzzed with a rumor wave, so fast it practically traveled by bloodstream. The float nurse was Navy. No, not just Navy, special operations. No, not just special operations. She had a call sign. No, not just a call sign. Helicopter people had come looking for her. People who had not said good morning to Mara, for weeks now found reasons to pass by her chair in the staff alcove. She ignored all of them. Instead, she sat with a paper cup of untouched coffee between both hands and stared at nothing for several long minutes. Lee came in quietly and took the seat beside her. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. Mara glanced over. "For what?" "For not saying more sooner." Mara studied the younger nurse's face, then shook her head. "You saw me." That wasn't enough. "It matters anyway." Lee hesitated. "Were you really all of that?" The corner of Mara's mouth moved, almost a smile. "I was a nurse," she said. "Everything else was weather." Lee laughed softly despite herself. "That is the most intimidating answer I've ever heard." For the first time that day, Mara actually smiled. Not big. Not bright. But real. "You should have seen me 10 years ago." Lee looked down at her hands, then back up. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Mara leaned back against the wall. "Because I came here to work," she said. "Not to explain myself. Because every room has people who decide what you are before you speak, and I was tired of auditioning for respect. Because some chapters of my life belong to other people too. And because I wanted to know whether a civilian hospital could still see a nurse when the story was taken away." Lee absorbed that slowly. "And?" Mara looked through the glass, toward the hall where staff were still sneaking glances. They saw laundry first. An hour later, Dr. Rowan came to find her. "Mercer, out of surgery," he said. Still critical, but the surgeon says the abdominal bleed would have been missed another 10 minutes if you hadn't pushed. Myra nodded once. He's asking for you when he's extubated. She nodded again. Then Dr. Rowan shifted his weight like a man preparing to say something less clinical. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for anything I did directly, for not noticing more. Myra looked at him. I noticed that you were competent, he said. I did not notice that competence was being wasted on purpose. That's on me too. She accepted that without rescuing him from it. That's fair, she said. He exhaled, perhaps surprised she had let the truth stand without softening it. By evening, Ryan Mercer was stable enough for brief supervised visitation. The tubes were fewer now. The color had returned just enough to his face that he looked less like a ghost and more like a man who had fought hard and was annoyed to be lying down. When Mara entered the ICU room, his eyes were already open. Clouded with medication. Still sharp. He looked at her for a long second before a weak grin broke across his face. I knew it, he rasped. Congratulations, Mara said. You nearly bled out, but your instincts remain excellent. He gave a rough laugh that turned into a wince. You still talk like that. And you still ignore pain. He moved his head a fraction toward the glass. They know who you are now. Mara looked back once, then shrugged. Enough. Ryan's expression softened. About time. She stepped closer to adjust the edge of his blanket. You're supposed to be retired. So are you. I'm doing laundry now. He closed his eyes briefly, smiling. That sounds like somebody made a terrible mistake. Mara said nothing. Ryan opened his eyes again. Tell me you're staying. At the hospital. He gave the smallest nod. That depends. On what? She looked at the monitor, then at him. On whether they want a nurse or a story. Ryan's voice dropped. You were always both. When she left the ICU room, Donna Hales was waiting outside with Kelsey. That told Mara everything she needed to know. Formal apology. Public enough to protect management. Private enough to avoid witnesses. Donna began first. Mara, on behalf of hospital leadership, I want to apologize for the way your abilities were assessed and utilized. It does not reflect our standards. Mara kept her eyes on her, not helping, not interrupting. Donna continued. Effective immediately, I'd like to discuss moving you into a permanent senior emergency role, if you are willing. Then Kelsey cleared her throat. I also owe you an apology, she said, each word obviously expensive. I made assumptions I should not have. Mara let the silence sit there for a moment. Long enough for both women to feel it. Then she answered Kelsey first. No, she said. Kelsey blinked. No. No, you should not have. The younger woman's face tightened. Mara went on, still calm. You decided I was small because I wasn't loud. You decided support work was punishment. You decided the person carrying sheets could not also carry a trauma room. That is not a staffing error. That is a character habit. Donna shifted uncomfortably. Myra turned to her. If you want me in a senior role, fine. But only if the expectation changes for everyone, not just for me because a helicopter made my past convenient. Donna straightened. What are you asking for? Cross-training based on demonstrated skill, not favorites. No using service assignments to humiliate staff. Structured observation for float nurses before anyone labels them. And if you send someone to laundry, you say thank you, because clean linens are not beneath nursing. They are part of patient care. Kelsey lowered her eyes. Donna nodded slowly. That can be done. Mara studied her for a second, measuring whether the answer was real or merely tactical. Then she said, good. She did not gloat. She did not ask for Kelsey's job. She did not drag the humiliation wider than it had already gone. That was never her style. The next week, St. Gabriel changed in 100 small ways that mattered more than any grand speech. Float nurses were no longer treated like spare parts. Assignments were documented. Lee was placed into a structured trauma development track under Dr. Rowan's supervision. The service level received better logging and staffing because, as it turned out, the nurse who had been sent there as a dismissal had quietly uncovered 3 recurring supply failures and fixed them before anyone bothered to ask how. As for Mara, she accepted the senior emergency role, but only part-time. She said she still wanted some float hours. When Donna asked why, Mara answered, because every floor tells the truth about a hospital. 3 days after the helicopter incident, Kelsey found her in the warming room folding blankets. For a second, it seemed history might repeat itself. But Kelsey stepped inside slowly, shut the door, and said, "I used to think people who stayed quiet were either afraid or weak." Mara kept folding. "And now?" she asked. Kelsey swallowed. "Now I think sometimes they just don't need permission from the room." Mara placed the blanket on the stack and finally looked at her. "That's closer," she said. Kelsey nodded once, accepting even that small reply like something earned. Then she surprised both of them. "I signed up for the training review," she said. "The one for bias in assignment decisions." Mara held her gaze a second longer, then returned to the blankets. "Good." It was not forgiveness in a dramatic sense. It was better. It was a chance to become less foolish. 2 weeks later, Ryan Mercer left the ICU with a cane, a scar that would harden with time, and orders to be less reckless, orders he had no intention of truly obeying. Before discharge, he asked the hospital to gather whoever had been present in Trauma One on the day of arrival. They met in a conference room with bad coffee and better silence. Ryan stood at the front beside Commander Shaw, leaned slightly on the cane, and looked around the room. "I know most of you only know pieces," he said. "So here's the part that matters. Years ago, when things went bad in a place none of you would ever volunteer to stand, this woman kept 18 people alive long enough for the rest of us to get home. She did it while taking orders from fools, ignoring pain, and building a triage line out of almost nothing. We called her Triage One because when she was in the room, panic had competition." A few people smiled. A few looked down. Ryan turned toward Mara. "And the first thing your hospital did," he added dryly, "was send her to laundry." Soft laughter rippled through the room, uncomfortable for some, cleansing for others. Mara shook her head once, not amused enough to encourage the line. Ryan's expression gentled. "My point is this," he said. "The person doing the quiet work may be the one holding the whole building together. Don't wait for a helicopter to tell you who deserves respect." Nobody forgot that sentence. Least of all Kelsey. Months later, new hires at St. Gabriel would still hear the story in pieces. The helicopter. The call sign. The trauma bay. The nurse who had been underestimated so badly the Navy had to correct the hospital in public. But the people who had actually been there remembered something deeper. They remembered the way Mara had responded when the room was finally hers. Not with revenge the cheap way. Not with humiliation for humiliation. But with standards. With calm. With clarity. With the kind of authority that does not need to perform because it has already survived harder rooms. And every now and then, when Lee worked a difficult intake or a frightened veteran looked close to spiraling, she would hear Mara's voice from that first day in Trauma 3. "Look at me, not the ceiling. Breathe. Good. Again." That became part of the unit too. Not because it was dramatic. Because it worked. Late one evening, long after the hospital had settled into its quieter rhythm, Mara passed through the service corridor again with a cart of fresh blankets. The same corridor. The same metal wheels. The same smell of detergent and warm cotton. Only now, when an orderly held the door for her, he said, "Thanks, Lieutenant Commander." Mara stopped, one brow lifting. "Just Mara is fine." He smiled awkwardly. "Still, thank you." She nodded and rolled on. At the far end of the hall, she paused beside the warming cabinet and rested a hand on the top blanket. Clean. Dry. Ready. She looked at the neat stack for a long second, then closed the cabinet door. Some people thought dignity came from titles. Some thought it came from recognition. Some needed a public reversal before they understood what had been standing in front of them all along. Mara knew better. Dignity lived in the work, in the hand that steadied a frightened patient, in the eye that caught the bleed before the monitor did, in the nurse who prepared the room before anyone else realized the room would matter. That was why being sent to laundry had never really shamed her. It had only exposed everyone else. And maybe that was the quietest revenge of all. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments what moment hit you hardest: the helicopter landing, the call sign, or the line Ryan gave the room about respect. And if you believe the quiet ones are often carrying more than anyone sees, stay with silent revenge stories for the next story, because sometimes silence is not weakness. It is discipline, waiting for the right moment to be heard.